we went over some cohort studies. We gave one example in the video because it's one of the largest and also one of the most complete statistical adjustment models. And it followed 500,000 people over 16 years. Essentially, people cooking with canola had a lower risk of cardiovascular mortality than people cooking with butter. And then if you look at the canola and the olive oil, they look identical. The evidence certainly doesn't seem to support this idea that canola oil is giving us heart attacks and strokes and these things you hear on social media. There was one trial that we included where everybody has had a fatty liver at baseline, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, so NAFLD, and then they were given olive oil or canola oil were the two exposures. And in both groups, there was an improvement in NAFLD metrics. Pretty impressive, 60-something to 70-something% of participants went into the normal range for the liver metrics. Doesn't seem to compute at all with these ideas that it's making you metabolically sick, it's making you fat, it's making you diabetic. My shock with where the evidence is and where the social media discourse is and what people are being exposed to consistently from the majority of influencers and then what's been shown scientifically is almost night and day.
When it comes to nutrition, there is little more controversial than seed oils. Within this category of plant-derived oils sits the notorious canola or rapeseed oil. Online, you'll find many likening canola oil to machine lubricant, claiming that it's highly inflammatory, causes cardiometabolic disease, and should be avoided like the plague. Is this well supported by the evidence? Do we really need to fear canola oil? That's what I explore in this conversation with Dr. Gil Carvalho. To kick things off here, I'd love to know the rationale for the video you recently put up on canola oil. What inspired this?
Yeah, kind of like most of our content, it started with viewer questions. We just started getting a ton of questions about canola, seemingly out of the blue, about a year ago, maybe 2 years ago. Out of nowhere, people just started asking, canola, is it true that it's poison, it's toxic? Is this stuff true? And kind of caught us off guard. I didn't know where this was coming from. I hadn't seen this evidence for harm, so I was curious. And at one point, these questions were so consistent that we decided, all right, let's do a systematic overview and see what the health effects of canola are according to the literature and make a video about it.
Is it genuinely just a personal curiosity because of all of those comments that you were getting? And for full transparency, I guess, were you engaged by any companies or industries that are tied to canola, or was this solely an individual pursuit?
Yeah, we have no conflict of interests with any topic, any video. We have no sponsors. We decline all offers of sponsorship. We don't have any ties to any industry. We don't even have a Patreon account because that was the vision from the beginning, to be completely independent and just tell people what's out there and let them make their own decision and not introduce that extra level of concern or suspicion. Just have the communication channel be as clean as possible. So yeah, zero financial or marketing ties. I didn't even have a strong opinion about canola going in because I hadn't done yet one of this systematic overview, and I didn't even have a personal preference when it comes to canola for cultural and geographical reasons. I was raised in the south of Europe. Canola oil is not common here. I think I was probably in my 20s or 30s when I first heard about canola oil. So I had no opinion really.
So it's not like you would be walking down the aisle of your grocery store and we're always walking past canola oil and thinking, ooh, I'm going to steer clear of that and buying olive oil instead. You literally had no pre-held beliefs at all.
No, pretty much none. I don't even remember seeing canola oil for sale or noticing it. In my family and in where I grew up, eating olive oil is more common. but I had no strong views on whether canola was healthier or as healthy or less healthy or detrimental. Really had no strong opinions on it. I hadn't seen the evidence on harm. I had seen some trials here and there, but few generally seem to point to benefit or safety. But sometimes you've seen a couple of things, and then you do a more comprehensive search, and you realize the balance of evidence is different. So that was certainly a possibility.
Right. So if you were, before you had done this exercise, if you were forced to take a position as a scientist based on how familiar you were with the research at that point in time, and perhaps based on maybe what other scientists who you respect, some of their positions, you would have thought that canola oil was relatively neutral or perhaps beneficial. That would have been your, I guess, hypothesis leading into this exercise rather blindly.
Maybe based on the composition, since it's in the same ballpark as olive oil, if I had to guess before looking at the evidence, my guess would have been that the health effects would be similar. But that sometimes we're surprised by the health effects of foods that seem fine in biochemical terms. So it wouldn't floor me if I had found some concerns, or if I found in some contexts, for example, not good or not as good as olive oil.
So similar to olive oil, this brings up, I think, something that we should just hit early in this conversation is some of the definitions and just understanding what it is we're talking about here. So first and foremost, what is canola oil? And olive oil, I think most people know it's sourced from olives. Canola oil has couple of different names that at least appear in the literature and perhaps on bottles in the store. So what is canola oil and where is it sourced from?
So it's sourced from a seed, and they actually refer to the plant as rapeseed. And so that's the other common name you'll see is rapeseed oil. And the word rape there has nothing to do with the crime. It's actually comes from the Latin word for turnip, because it's a relative of turnip and Brussels sprouts and these brassica family plants. And so the original rapeseed oil wasn't used for food purposes because it was bitter, and due to the content of erucic acid, made it very bitter. And there was some evidence suggesting harm of erucic acid at high level. So what they did at some point was they bred this cultivar of the rapeseed plant where the seeds have a low content of erucic acid. And so that got rid of those problems. And then in Canada, initially, they started calling it canola. It's a contraction of Canada, oil, low in acid. And that became popular. In the US now, it's often referred to as canola oil. In Europe, it's still referred to as rapeseed oil, even the new version. In the UK, I think they still call it rapeseed oil. In Scandinavia, there's a number of countries that use it. Interestingly, in Scandinavia, there's a number of countries that use it sort of like for Southern Europe, olive oil is the default. In Northern Europe, I think rapeseed oil is the oil that they use for food. So yeah, you find these different names. But that's essentially the where it's obtained from, and then the composition is essentially 60-something% monounsaturated, so predominantly monounsaturated fat, 7% saturated. The difference there with olive oil is about 70-something mono, 14% saturated, and then for polys is the rest, so 28% in the case of canola and 20-ish for olive oil. No, less, probably around 10 for olive oil for PUFAs.
So it is, by classification, it comes from a seed, so it would fall into this umbrella bucket of seed oils. But in terms of fat profile, it's actually more like olive oil than it is to, say, soybean or corn or safflower oil, which are much lower in monounsaturated fats and contain quite a bit more omega-6 linoleic acid. Would that be accurate?
Exactly. Technically, it's a seed oil, but unlike most seed oils, it's much lower in linoleic acid.
You mentioned that there was some selective breeding, and that was done to make it a healthier food product. I think you mentioned an acid there. I forget the name that you used, but does that mean that this is erucic acid? Is that it?
Yeah.
Does that mean that it is genetically modified? Is it considered a GMO?
So that initial breeding process was not GMO. It was just a natural breeding and selection. Nowadays, and actually this started probably 20 years ago or so, they did develop a GMO version for the purposes of, to use pesticides. It's resistant to pesticides. So the Monsanto Roundup, it's resistant to glyphosate. So depending on the country and on the brand, there are GMO versions and non-GMO versions. But so, yeah, that initial process was not related to GMO, but they have come up with the GMO version of the seed.
Do you know much about the processing? How the seed is transformed into an oil, or how the oil is extracted out, and what is and perhaps isn't involved in that process?
A little bit. So there's basically two types, right? There's the refined type and the cold pressed type. And the main difference is the exposure to heat. So in the cold pressed, they grind it and extract the oil without the heat exposure. And then in the refined kind, which is the more common type that you'll find in stores, there is a heating process, there is a deodorization process, and they use these solvents, the hexane. So there is a number of additional steps to the processing, to the refining, and the heating. I think is probably the most relevant. The hexane, I think people ask questions about that as well, but heating would probably be the number one difference there.
Yeah, based on my read of the claims that are made online from people who are of the view that canola oil is, let's quote unquote, toxic or harmful or something that we should minimize exposure to, it usually comes back to 3 or 4 things, and I think we've already hit on them. One is that it's a seed oil, and by default, it must be harmful, genetically modified, and then the processing. So the fact that there's deodorization, the involvement of hexane, that it's heated. Would you agree that this is the basis of most of the claims that exist, or have you seen people also pointing to specific forms of evidence to kind of support the idea that canola oil is toxic?
I think that's pretty accurate. I think it all sits on the idea of it not being a natural thing, of it being an artificial food. That, I think, is the basic idea, and it is very powerful in terms of messaging. And I wouldn't say that that's irrelevant either. And then I think most of these other concepts sit on it. The fact that it's refined, that there's hexane added, that it's heated, the purification, all of this sits on this idea that it's an unnatural food, that our ancestors didn't need it, that it's new evolutionarily. It all stems from this idea of what's natural and what's unnatural. Some people call it a naturalistic fallacy, but the original concern, I think, is that. And then with the linoleic acid, I think there's all these concerns with inflammation as well. There is this link to the biochemical pathway of linoleic acid being converted to arachidonic acid and so on, to pro-inflammatory compounds, leukotrienes and prostaglandins, and this kind of thing. So that's another concern, is that perhaps eating foods or a diet high in linoleic acid might lead to an elevation of these compounds, which then would lead to inflammation in the body.
Right, and canola oil kind of enters that conversation because it contains more linoleic acid than, say, olive oil or butter. Even though it has less than some of the other seed oils, it's still considered to contain, I guess, an appreciable amount. Or if someone's taking that position that linoleic acid would increase inflammation, I assume that what they're saying is you could cook with better fats than canola oil that contain less linoleic acid. Said differently. So what would you say, Jill, if someone said, look, I don't need any more information other than the fact that this is new, it's ultra processed, there may have been some selective breeding or GMO, it might be a GMO, there's heating and deodorization and the use of these solvents like hexane. That's enough for me to know that this surely cannot be healthy. I don't need to be shown a meta-analysis or a bunch of meta-analyses or any studies. That's enough.
At the level of individual choice, I don't think there's a problem there. If the person prefers or feels safer or feels more comfortable not consuming canola or not consuming any seed oils or any oils for that matter. Some people prefer not to eat any oils at all and just get their fats from whole forms of whole foods. At a level of personal choice, I think that's completely fine. And it's not a problem nutritionally. You don't need canola oil in your diet. My concern is not that choice. My concern is basing firm beliefs on poor heuristics, because sooner or later you're going to make decisions that are detrimental or potentially detrimental. And in fact, we see plenty associated with these ideas of seed oils. When people say, I avoid seed oils, I don't see a problem. The problem is that the same influencers and the same logic then leads to making choices like, so instead of seed oils, I lather butter and lard on everything. So you get to things, once you make one decision that's based on emotion or just these kind of one-liner first glance ideas that don't pan out scientifically in terms of the actual health effect of the foods, you're going to be more prone to make all kinds of decisions in a chain on that logic. And so, for example, swapping unsaturated fats for predominantly saturated fats, there's so much evidence stacked against that in the long run. We're talking about substantial amounts, right? If you have a little bit of butter and your lipids are good, whatever. But people being scared of unsaturated fats and eating a lot of butter and lard instead in a Western population is going to be a terrible decision. But if they prefer olive oil, if they feel safer with olive oil or almonds or whatever, I don't see a problem.
Yeah, have at it. Okay, so you and your team decide to take on a topic like this. You decide, okay, we're going to tackle canola oil, despite all of the trolling that might come with approaching a topic like this on YouTube. You're a brave man. Where do you start? What does the research process actually look like when you set out to investigate how a food like canola oil affects human health and whether it is something that we should be okay including in our diet or whether it's something that we should be minimizing our exposure to?
So, first of all, I don't mind at all when people disagree and have different views, because that actually I've learned with time. When I started making videos, when you're a beginner as a creator, you're terrified of people who don't like your content. What I've learned with experience is that's actually a good sign. It's a sign that you're tapping into a diverse crowd. Because if I publish a video and 100% of viewers say, I agree with everything you said, it's exactly my thoughts exactly, I've added nothing. I've delivered no value, right? But if I publish a video going over 30 trials and I have people pulling their hair out in the comments, chances are I've shown them something that they hadn't seen before, that they hadn't heard before. And the reactions to this video are among the most polarizing that we've ever had, including cholesterol, saturated fats, statins. I think the seed oils topic, for reasons that I don't entirely understand, are more polarizing and more inflammatory, pun intended. Yeah, we get people throwing fits in the comments over these trials, and yeah, so we can talk about more about that. But so in terms of the process for a video like this, where we're pretty much trying to go over everything that's available and giving people an idea of balance of evidence. The main thing is we try to do it systematically. So what we want to avoid is showing people a pocket of evidence, and then they go click on the next video, and it's a different pocket of evidence, and people are just completely confused. Experts can't agree and all this stuff. So we want to give them an idea of balance of evidence to explain what's out there to the extent that it's possible. So the process is pretty standard. This is like what you do in research science. Every time you start a new research project, you try to get a glance of everything. You start with the top of the evidence hierarchy, meta-analyses of trials, meta-analyses of cohort studies, systematic reviews. Get a bunch of those, go through a bunch of those. Then you start to work your way down, start to look at individual trials, individual cohort studies. Then we start to plug in the holes. So specific questions that the viewers might have, like, what if it's cold pressed canola oil? What if it's heated canola oil? That might not be specified in a meta-analysis because it's very kind of bird's eye view. So then we start searching the databases for specific trials and studies on those questions to fill in the gaps. And then sort of the final process is more just making sure, reassuring ourselves that we have a grasp. We go through kind of narrative reviews, especially more recent ones, and a bunch of them. And when we start seeing that their references are things that we already have in our notes, like we're familiar with the field, right? That gives us more confidence that we have an idea of everything that's out there. And then the final thing that we did for this video, I hired some people to research, not instead of me, but as a stress test of what I had done. So I didn't tell them what I found. I just gave them specific questions. So canola, effect of canola on insulin resistance. What's out there in terms of trials or cohort studies in humans? And then see what they bring back and see if there's anything that I've missed. And so once we start to see a lot of repetition, then the confidence is there that we have a grasp on the balance of evidence, then we put things together.
Yeah, you can begin to be quite confident that you've been able to review this in an objective manner and you haven't missed anything when you're engaging other people to answer those questions as well. Why the focus on human data over in vitro or animal studies?
I think animal studies and in vitro data have their place. Actually, interestingly, my background is all in mechanistic research. My publications the vast majority are in mechanistic research. So in rodents and other animals and in cell culture and biochemistry, most of my scientific work has been under that umbrella. So I'm certainly not biased against it, but I'm very, very comfortable stating where that fits and where it does not fit. And so I think mechanistic research is great for hypothesis generation. It's great for mechanistic insight to add more detail and another level of confidence when we have outcomes. But in terms of a bottom line for a lay audience, showing mouse research, unless I'm going to explain a contradiction, right? That's fine. If I'm going to try to explain why they might encounter this that may or may not match the data in humans, then that has value. Otherwise, if I'm giving them a first video on the effects of canola oil, I want to look at the human data because I assume they're interested in the effects of canola oil on themselves and their families. And that trumps the effects on animals. Now, in the events where there are seeming mismatches between mechanistic data and outcome data or human data, we can often understand why that is. It might be a dosage issue. A lot of times the research in animals and rodents is with a dosage that's much higher than the normal intake in humans. Sometimes it's purified molecules, concentrated. And other times it's physiological differences between animals and between other non-human animals and us. But the bottom line for people watching is they want to know what's going to happen to them in all likelihood if they consume canola oil or not. And I think that's best demonstrated by the human data. The last thing to say is that in a video like this, because there was a substantial amount of human data, I think that goes over pretty well. In a field where there's none or almost none, and you have to make educated guesses from mouse data, then that might make more sense. But once you have, as we'll probably cover, once you have, hundreds of trials and cohort study after cohort study and meta-analysis of dozens of trials, we got plenty.
I just had Dr. Matthew Nagra and Dr. Alan Flanagan on, and we did an episode on lectins, and the importance of the context of animal studies came up, particularly in this lectin conversation. Exactly as you just said then, often in the animal studies, the dose that was used in those studies was not something that a human would be exposed to in a typical diet on a sort of gram per kilogram basis of body mass. And as you say, the form, a lot of those studies, in fact, almost all of them use isolated lectins as opposed to a whole food where lectins may behave completely differently when they're within the context of whatever food or food matrix that they're naturally coming in. So that's a good reminder. Meta-analysis. Remind people what that is and I guess what the strengths are of a meta-analysis.
Yeah, so meta-analysis is a study of studies. So you can have a meta-analysis of trials or a meta-analysis of cohort studies. And basically it's a way to get at balance of evidence. So you take, say, all the trials on a given question and you pool them together, you run some statistical analysis, and you're basically asking, what's the general direction of the evidence? And so the strength is basically that it's a higher bar, everything else held equal. So you're getting away from looking at individual trials. That might be a one-off or might be some context, some strange context or something weird that happened in one trial. And you're kind of forcing yourself to look at a broader data set. That's the main upside. Obviously, there's still scrutiny that goes into a meta-analysis. Some are excellent, some are not so good. So you still have to quality control.
Yeah, one of the critiques that I hear people put forward about meta-analyses is that they're only as good as the individual trials that are included. And you quite often hear people say, if you pull, aggregate junk data, then you still have junk data. So is there anything that you kind of keep in mind or you think about to determine if a meta-analysis is high quality, it's made up of robust data as opposed to one that sure has pulled several studies, but those studies themselves are low quality?
So you do want to go through the trials ideally. Also, the number of trials that are included is relevant. Inclusion-exclusion criteria for a meta-analysis matters. So some things are reasonable. Some things are, if there's a lot of you can cherry pick a meta-analysis by fiddling with the inclusion and exclusion criteria. So that's important. And then there are different methods to statistically analyze as well. And I think at the end of the day, for all of these things, the take-home message is reproducibility. So even at the level of meta-analysis, if it's one isolated meta-analysis, my confidence would always be somewhat more moderate. And I do want to see the same thing over and over at the level of trials and then at the level of meta-analysis. And that's when I start to be pretty confident that it's something legit. So I think that's the main, maybe the main currency, and answers a lot of these questions, a lot of the questions about funding, and a lot of questions about cherry picking, a lot of the questions about bias. If you have reproducibility across different teams, different populations, across decades of research, using different experimental approaches, and you keep seeing the same answer, it doesn't have to be every time because we know there's heterogeneity, but you keep seeing the same direction of effect, our confidence goes up. It's hard to overstate how important that is, because a lot of times we get lost in the weeds, and a lot of the concerns that people have is because this is not emphasized.
And converging lines of evidence, which you sort of just spoke to there, but meta-analyses of clinical trials, they're often shorter term, so maybe you see that there is improvement in certain blood lipids. But then the cohort studies, which are being carried out over 10, 20, 30 years, allow enough time to look at events, heart attack, strokes, cardiovascular mortality, and you see the same exposure is associated with reduced risk of those events, and you can start to be, I guess, a little bit more confident in your position and the robustness of those findings. When cohort studies come up, I think there's this idea out there, and there might be quite a bit of overlap actually between people that take the position that seed oils are toxic or canola oil is toxic. I think many of them may also believe that epidemiology is very unreliable, and they, when taking this position, from what I've seen, they usually point to two things. One is they point to confounding factors. So is it that canola oil, for example, is reducing risk of cardiovascular disease, or is it just that people who are consuming more canola oil also smoke less, eat more fiber, etc., and such? Is the reduction in risk of cardiovascular disease actually explained by other aspects of their lifestyle? And then the second thing I see them often point to is this idea that dietary recall, the reliability of that is very low, and because people are really poor at accurately telling us what they eat, how can these studies be useful? So tell me why you believe epidemiology and these cohort studies are important, and why they're not unreliable and can actually form part of the evidence base in a review like what you've just done here with canola oil.
So first, just a general point that when someone says they don't believe epidemiology, I think that's fine if they're consistent with that. If it's a consistent heuristic factor for them, I respect that. If their bar is just very high, but there needs to be consistency. If you don't believe that epidemiology matters, then there's all kinds of things that you're going to have to discard, including a lot of effect of a lot of things on cancer that we take for granted. The effect of trans fats is largely hinges on epidemiological research. There's lots of things that we pretty much take for granted. Effective, even things like exercise and a healthy diet in terms of long-term outcomes, mortality and cancer, things that you can't realistically run a randomized trial. So as long as they're consistent with epidemiology not being reliable, I can respect that. But if it's selective, if it's epidemiology doesn't count for seed oils, but then for other things, I hold a firm belief that these things are definitely good or bad, and they're mainly rooted in epidemiology in the first place, I question whether there's a strong heuristic there or whether it's an ad hoc decision-making process. That's just a general point. In terms of the specific weaknesses of epidemiology, I think it's good to bear them in mind. I agree that they are soft spots. I think the realization is that every experimental approach has soft spots. Sometimes the misconception is that randomized trials are this perfect thing that you just frame in gold and you put on the wall. Randomized trials have plenty of caveats as well. So these things work complementary. With regards to the two specific ones that you brought up, I agree those are the two most common ones. So with the confounders, the way you address that is with statistical adjustment models. And most of the common things that people ask, tobacco, BMI, exercise, these things are included. So you're trying to minimize the probability that the effect is due to one of those confounders. The adjustment is never perfect, so that's good to bear in mind and not overstate the results. In terms of the memory, there is one clarification that might be useful. Sometimes people say on social media, well, I don't even remember what I had for lunch last week, let alone what I ate a year ago. That's not really how these questionnaires work. I agree. If that was the question, I don't remember what I had for breakfast a week ago. But if you ask me, how many cans of soda average do I consume in a day or in a week? How many steaks in a week? How many bowls of oatmeal in a week? I can give you a very precise answer to those. So I'm not saying it's perfection and precision. I am saying it's very different from remember what you ate yesterday or a week ago, right? So the other thing to point out is there have been a number of analyses comparing observational studies to interventional studies, so epidemiology to RCTs in terms of the results. And they generally support that most of the time, more often than not, they align. So this goes back to what we were talking about a minute ago, that it's about reproducibility. You would never look at an epidemiological study, even if it's robust, and immediately say, this causes that. But that doesn't mean that it can't be part of the causal inference, the process of accumulation of evidence in a given direction that raises our confidence that there likely is a cause and effect relationship. And so epidemiology goes into that bag, randomized trials go into that bag with their weaknesses, with their strengths, and the mechanistic data goes into that bag as well. The other thing to say just briefly is within epidemiology, there's different ways to ask the question. And so, for example, with seed oils, with linoleic acid, you can ask people how much they ate, but you can actually, since it's an essential nutrient, you can measure their levels of linoleic acid in their tissues. And because it's all coming from the outside, your body doesn't produce it. That gives you another way to confirm that the intake data is generally, in the right place.
How do you know in that instance, though, if we're speaking here directly to canola oil, that the linoleic acid status is from canola oil and it's not from other oils?
Yeah, you don't. No, this wouldn't be specifically a confirmation of canola oil intake. This would be for linoleic acid in general. I don't think you could differentiate between different sources of linoleic acid. It would be just for the specific question of linoleic acid as the exposure and the outcome inflammation or something else, which is a question that's asked in many studies. And so that's one way to ask that. Now, if you're running a trial, for example, this is another interesting thing. People don't realize that in randomized controlled trials, in the vast majority, you're still relying on self-report, with the exception of metabolic ward trials, which exist but are few and far between. You're still sending people home and then asking them if they ate the thing they're supposed to eat. So, there's always this level of uncertainty there. But with a randomized trial, you can measure different parameters, and you can get a sense, depending on the nutrients at stake, you can get a sense that they are following the recommendations based on these parameters that vary between the different intervention groups.
Yeah, some great points there, particularly that point there about the biomarkers, and I'm seeing that being done more and more as a way of kind of verifying that the dietary data that's being collected matches the status of some nutrient. And then Walter Willett, in my conversation with him, he also brought up a couple of important points that I might just tack on here. Many of the food frequency questionnaires, at least in a subset of subjects, have been validated against weighed food records. So there is some verification that there is a high correlation between when someone actually measures and weighs out all of their food and when they recall food using that tool, that questionnaire, that they're correlating very well. So researchers will often look to find a validated food frequency questionnaire that's been validated in a particular population relevant to whatever they're studying. And then the second point that he made, this is a little bit of inside baseball, I guess, and not that relevant to people unless they're digging into these studies. But if there's a 20 or 30 year follow-up, it's nice to see that they have repeated dietary recall, say, every 4 years, instead of just in 1980, did a food frequency questionnaire and then no further questions were asked over 30 years. A lot of those people would have changed their dietary habits through that period. But it's all of these sorts of little things, I guess, that we can look at when we're reviewing the evidence to understand how the quality of the study that we're looking at and how much weight, I guess, to give those results, or also may help us explain why there's varying results from different studies, some of these things.
Another thing that might help to point out is the difference between knowing with precision exactly how many grams of this food cause risk versus the general direction of effect. So I think it is fair to say that there is less confidence with regards to granularity if you want to know exactly how many grams of something give you a benefit, or exactly after what threshold with precision causes a risk to pop up. I would agree that the gray area there is bigger, but when you're looking at the general effect of a food, the general direction of effect, is it cardioprotective? Is it damaging for cardiovascular risk? Does it increase risk of diabetes? That, I think, the confidence is higher, and that gets around a lot of this precision aspect of somebody embellishes a little bit what they report, or somebody forgets a little bit. Yes, but if I eat 7 steaks a week, I'm probably not going to say 0. I might say 6 or 5. And if I'm a vegan, I'm probably not going to say 10 steaks a week. So you're going to get the general distribution is going to be there. The granularity might be a little off.
Quick one, folks. I get asked all the time about buying supplements and getting blood tests. The good news is I've created comprehensive and completely free guides for both. Simply head over to my website, theproof.com, to download them. That's theproof.com. Okay, let's get back to the episode. Before we step through the evidence and the conclusions that you've kind of come to based on that evidence, at a high level, would you say that this topic of canola oil in human health has been well researched in terms of the amount of data that's available, the quality of data? Do we have enough information to feel pretty confident in the various positions that we'll be walking through today?
Yes and no. I think there's a lot of research. There's a lot of trials and large cohort studies. I was surprised at how much there was. I would still say that there are areas of uncertainty that I could name 10 different things that I would like to see, or 10 different trials. Again, more around the edges of the details, like how, if you heat it this much, and if it's cold pressed versus refined, and if it's, in the context of this food, and that, I think there's certainly areas of uncertainty. But with regards to the large points, I thought there was a lot of research. The consistency was very surprising. I was above all shocked by the contrast between the amount and the direction of the scientific evidence and the discourse on social media. And having done this now for a few years, I am a little bit jaded, but it still rocks me when I see things so almost like mirror images, or like opposites of what people are being told, and then what the general direction of evidence is. It's still mind-blowing.
So what was the general direction? Was it generally neutral? Was it generally beneficial?
Depends on the outcome, but generally safety of consumption of canola, even in some of these contexts where people are more worried, like refined canola oil, cooked canola oil, in general, again, and we'll make some distinctions. We're not talking about canola in an ultra-processed food and an a highly caloric snack. We're talking about just canola on a salad or sautéing with it, using it, canola itself, and using like home cooking, right? If you're going to fry it for 5 days in a row in an industrial fryer at Burger King, all bets are off. But for regular use at home, I just kept seeing either no significant changes, safety, or benefit. For the cardiovascular outcomes, more in the direction of benefit. For things like glucose metabolism, more in the direction of neutrality. Yeah, it depended on the outcome.
There wasn't a 5-day Burger King fry-up study in there?
Yes and no. I did find studies exposing canola oil, not at Burger King necessarily, but to long exposures of heat. And by the time you heat it for days, we're talking 3-4 days in a row, you start to see the trans fat content go up. But short of that, even studies looking at pretty long exposures that I don't think would be recommended anyway, like several hours of cooking, and some studies try to push the envelope, baking for a long time at such high temperatures that the food starts to burn. Past the smoke point, you start to see smoke come out of it, and they still don't detect a statistically significant increase in trans fats. So, yeah, within the realms of a reasonable use, I just don't see, and I'm open to other evidence and I'm open to whatever, but I just don't see the justification for the stampede.
Okay, let's step through some of the specific evidence, starting with cardiovascular disease, which you just mentioned. What do we know about canola oil consumption and how it affects important blood lipids that increase the risk of cardiovascular disease?
So there are dozens of trials, randomized control trials, looking at the effect of canola oil on blood lipids and comparing them to other fats. So, and then there are many meta-analyses that agglomerate all of this and look at the general picture. So one meta-analysis that we focused on in the video, because I thought it was interesting, because they look at head-to-head comparisons with other fats. So the comparator is very clear, and that's, as we all know, crucial for nutrition. So it was a meta-analysis of 42 randomized controlled trials. And the four types of fat they used were canola, olive oil, sunflower seed oil, and then higher saturated fat foods like butter. And basically, when they compared trials looking at canola versus olive oil, LDL cholesterol was a little lower on canola in average. But then ApoB, which I assume your viewers are familiar with, as a better metric, a more reliable metric of cardiovascular risk, no significant difference between the two. We can argue if that's statistical power or what that is, but that's the result. Then canola compared to sunflower seed oil, identical. LDL cholesterol a little lower in canola, no significant difference with ApoB. And then canola compared to the saturated fat high foods, both LDL cholesterol and ApoB reduced on canola, and actually triglycerides significantly reduced as well. So that's the data for the markers. You looked like you had a question.
Yeah, Jill, if someone has elevated ApoB and they're wanting to lower that through some dietary changes, something that many guests on this show, and I think you're one of them that we've spoken about, is the substitution of saturated fats with polyunsaturated fats being particularly helpful. And based on the canola oil fat profile, it has more polyunsaturated fats than olive oil. So would the assumption be that it could be more helpful than olive oil as a substitution for, say, butter for someone who's looking to lower ApoB? I know you mentioned a study there and you said maybe it's statistical power, but where are you leaning towards in terms of lipid optimization for someone that is wanting to lower ApoB Are they reaching for canola, or are they reaching for olive oil, or are they reaching for one of these other seed oils that's higher in polyunsaturated fats again?
Yeah, based on the result of the meta-analysis, I don't have a strong belief in superiority. So it seems that if there is a difference, it doesn't seem to be very large. It's possible that canola oil, I've seen one isolated trial where canola oil lowered ApoB more than olive oil, but because it's not a consistent enough finding to reach significance in the meta-analysis, and this could be because it's a small number of trials, ApoB is a less common measure to be reported than LDL cholesterol. So it could be that it's just not been reported as much, but I would say unclear. So either one, if you're going to replace butter with either one, I would expect a drop. Experimenting would also not be unreasonable, seeing maybe there's an individual difference. And then obviously there's other changes to diet and exercise and other lifestyle components that could be done. But yeah, that's pretty much where I stand.
Were there any studies looking at canola oil versus nuts and seeds with regards to weight loss? This is probably where this comparison is most relevant given the calorie density of oils. I know, for example, people like Dr. Joel Fuhrman, who I've had on the show, is wary of oils because of their calorie density and believes nuts and seeds are perhaps a better way to get fats without exceeding calories.
Yeah, we looked for that specifically. We could only find one with canola specifically. They compared nuts to canola oil, and there's some experimental caveats there. It was a canola oil that they mixed with a oats-based cereal. I think because of methodological reasons, if you just give people the canola, they're probably going to use that instead of another fat. So we might introduce another confounder. So they created this cereal with high in canola and told people to replace the cereal they were eating for breakfast with that one. And then they report that the caloric content was about even. So they kind of satisfied themselves that it was an even swap. So there's some things that could be pointed out there, but bottom line is in that trial, so it's nuts versus this canola oil medium, and they measured a lot of different parameters from lipids to glucose metabolism parameters, body mass and body weight, I think blood pressure. No significant difference in any of them. So it's just one trial, so I would be cautious not overstating that. We actually have a video coming soon where we went over every trial and any study that we could find comparing oils to nuts and seeds for any kind of oil. And we found maybe a dozen or 2 dozen total. So not a lot. There's definitely, it's fair to say that there's some uncertainty there. And with canola, this is the only one that I remember. But like I said before, if someone feels safer eating almonds or walnuts or flax seeds, I don't see a problem with that.
Is there any early insight from that video? Is that the general trend, that based on the studies that exist, there doesn't seem to be a significant benefit either way, swapping equivalent calories from an oil, plant oil, non-tropical oil, I'm assuming, for nuts and seeds?
Pretty much. There's some heterogeneity. In some studies you see a seeming advantage of one, in others another, but overall no clear superiority. And I don't have a very strong opinion on this, but I haven't seen clear data either way. So I don't see a problem if people choose. I think it's my issue is when people make confident claims and the evidence is just not there. When they say this one is definitely going to be better because XYZ. If the evidence A doesn't exist, or even worse, exists and doesn't support that, why would you have a strong belief in that direction? But this is more a disagreement with other communicators and not so much with the public. If people are more comfortable getting their fats from whole forms of fat, I wouldn't even want to confuse them by going over these trials, because I just don't think it's an important question in terms of nutrition science.
I don't want to digress too much, so I'll ask one question here. But in those studies where we're comparing an oil with nuts and seeds, how important is the dose that we're considering here? Because it might be that at a very small dose or exposure, there's no significant difference, but at a higher dose or a higher number of calories coming from either oil or nuts and seeds, that you begin to see a difference. Is that something that you considered?
It's certainly possible, and I think we made that video a while back. I don't remember the details, but I think we do have a note about that with some trials that have higher intake. I'm pretty sure we talked about it, and I don't remember the exact how high it went, but I think that's a very reasonable caveat that you can that goes for any question. You can always say, okay, in this range that has been tested, this is the evidence, but we don't know what happens at a higher or lower range that hasn't been assayed. I think that's always reasonable to say. So, but again, as a note of uncertainty, not a note of therefore this thing is definitely superior.
Coming back to canola oil, was there any difference between refined and unrefined canola oil on blood lipids?
So we looked at that specifically because a lot of viewers asked that question. Most trials don't specify which type of oil they use, which is annoying, but we did find a couple that specified it was refined canola oil, and we were able to get in touch with the authors of one or two trials as well that clarified that it was refined that they used. And so bottom line is we still saw the same direction of effect, even with refined canola oil, of either no significant difference or a reduction in blood lipids. And even when it was used to cook, same direction of effect. Now, I've never seen a trial, I don't think it exists, that compares in the same trial unrefined and refined canola oils head to head. It would be really cool to see. I haven't seen it. So I'm open to the possibility that there's an edge for one of them, but I haven't seen any evidence of that.
What about canola oil consumption and hard cardiovascular disease outcomes, like the risk of having a heart attack or a stroke or dying from cardiovascular disease?
Yeah, so we went over longer data sets because the trials are great, but the problem is they're usually shorter term. So we went over some cohort studies. We gave one example in the video because it's one of the largest and also one of the most complete statistical adjustment models. And it followed 500,000 people over 16 years. And essentially people cooking with canola had a lower risk of cardiovascular mortality than people cooking with butter. And then if you look at the canola and the olive oil, they look identical. There were some other comparators as well, margarine and some other stuff. I think corn oil was in there. But certainly between those two, that was the pattern. And then it was adjusted for all the common confounders that people ask about: BMI, exercise, tobacco. They actually tried to adjust for other foods as well. So overall dietary pattern was in the model, and it still survived those adjustments. So like we said before, this doesn't give me 100% confidence, but it's what can be done, right? And the direction of effect is concordant with the data from the trials. So I certainly, the evidence certainly doesn't seem to support this idea that canola oil is giving us heart attacks and strokes and these things you hear on social media.
You did speak about one long-term randomized controlled trial. If I recall correctly, I think you mentioned Leon Diet Heart Study in your video.
Yeah.
What's the significance of this study, and why did you feel it was important to include it? I guess even though it's not just a canola oil intervention.
Yeah, we brought up a couple of multi-pronged interventions where they used canola. I think it's part of the evidence base, but we were pretty careful to state the caveat that because multiple things change, we can't say that the benefit is coming from canola. But clearly it's consistent. A Mediterranean diet with canola oil In Lyon, they used both. They used a mix of olive oil and canola. And it's the strongest risk reduction in terms of cardiovascular outcomes for a dietary randomized trial that I've ever seen. 70% reduction in MACE, 70% reduction in mortality. So it's, again, does this tell me that it's canola delivering the benefit? No. But it certainly doesn't seem to support these ideas that canola is killing everybody and you might as well drink sewer water and whatever else is being yelled on social media.
What would you say to someone that looks at the Lyon Diet Hard study and says, Jill, I hear what you're saying, but this is in comparison to a pretty crummy diet. It's not the ancestral paleo diet that I'm eating.
I think that's a reasonable, not necessarily the ancestral paleo part, but the comparator is a reasonable point. So Lyon, the comparator was the regular diet, in this case, the French diet. So there are other trials of the Mediterranean diet that are better in that regard, like Predimed and Cordiaprev, where the comparator was also an intervention. So I think it's valid that Lyon, I think it's another caveat of Lyon that the comparator diet is not the cleanest. So yeah, that could certainly be a part of why the risk reduction is so impressive.
What about insulin resistance and glucose metabolism? Was there much evidence that was looking at how canola oil affects blood glucose control?
Yeah, also dozens of trials looking at glucose, looking at insulin levels, looking at insulin resistance. And just to state this largest meta-analysis, basically no significant difference in any of those three metrics, comparing canola oil to olive oil, saturated fat, and sunflower seed oil. And then with refined canola, similar. So we found one or two trials with refined canola looking at glucose metabolism metrics, and no significant change in fasting glucose. Insulin and insulin resistance actually were reduced compared to baseline on the canola oil group. Similar with the cooked trials, again, either no significant difference or reduced. One interesting thing that we found, one trial that used refined canola oil, we were talking about contrast of exposure before, and one trial used a massive amount. It was over 400 calories of canola oil a day on the canola group, which is 25% of calories from canola oil. And they still didn't see any detriment in terms of the metrics of glucose metabolism that they measured. So again, I don't see the rationale for this logic that these oils are making everybody insulin resistant and diabetic and these things you hear out there. If anything, the evidence seems to be pointing in the opposite direction.
We know that total calories and energy excess is the most important driver, or seems to be the most important driver, of visceral and ectopic fat between and inside our organs, particularly the liver, the pancreas, and muscle tissue, and that this increases insulin resistance, makes it harder to get glucose from the blood into the cells where it can be used for energy. You and I have spoken off air about the impact of dietary fat on insulin resistance, specifically the type of fat that we're consuming. What's your position here?
If you equate calories, I've seen some trials that point to a role definitely secondary to overall calories. And it seems that it's mostly in the context of a hypercaloric diet. So yeah, if you're in a hypercaloric state, unsaturated fats may be a bit kinder on the intrahepatic triglyceride accumulation. By the time that you get to isocaloric or hypocaloric, I think it's more granular. And certainly if people are losing weight, I think it's very common for them to see improvements in fatty liver and insulin resistance, pretty much regardless of their source of fat. So I think that's an argument that I think loses a little bit of strength if people are losing weight. Now, you can't lose weight forever. So at some point, you still have to contend with what's your maintenance diet. But yeah, I think it's certainly secondary to calorie balance.
Speaking of losing weight, I know that you looked at canola oil and body weight. Are people making claims that canola oil is inherently fattening? Is that something that you've seen?
I confess that I consume surprisingly little social media content for a YouTuber. I've seen a few videos, and I've definitely seen those claims very, very prevailingly about seed oils in general. I don't remember specifically about canola oil. Canola oil is making us fat. I have no doubt that we would be able to find if we've searched TikTok. But yeah, I haven't seen anybody make that distinction. Oh, seed oil makes us fat, but canola doesn't.
What did you find there?
Kind of similar. There are dozens of randomized trials. We've highlighted a meta-analysis of 23 randomized control trials where they actually found that canola oil reduced body weight. And the effect was very small, so I don't want to overemphasize that. The effect actually seemed more marked when comparing to saturated fat, more marked in people with diabetes. That said, I'm skeptical that that's even that it's a real effect, let alone a clinically meaningful reduction. They had other metrics in the same meta-analysis. So this was body weight that was reduced, but BMI, waist circumference, body fat, all no significant change. So my takeaway is that there doesn't seem to be a big difference. And again, the obvious caveats. We're talking about canola oil itself. We're not talking about junk food that happens to contain canola oil together with 1,000 other ingredients and is hypercaloric and hyperpalatable, the potato chips and the Pop-Tarts and whatever else. And the other caveat is that anytime you're talking about a concentrated source of fat, whether it's saturated or unsaturated, yeah, it's hypercaloric. So if you're lathering it on top of your regular diet, you're going to gain some weight. But if your overall caloric intake is reasonable, you can lose weight on a high fat diet. So I think that's not something that's going to make you fat magically.
I think this is where the compared to what also comes up with regards to nuts and seeds. And I think many people are of the view that if there was a trial, and I'm not sure if there is a trial that's looked at this, so ad lib, where you have one group that is told to consume canola oil, whether it's in cooking or on salads, and another group is told not to have canola oil, but they can have nuts and seeds, and it's ad lib. So we're not equating calories. Do the people who are using canola oil in their cooking and on their salads in their meals, do they gain more weight than the person who is getting their fats from a whole food source, nuts and seeds?
Yeah, the only trial that might get at that question that I've seen is that the one with the cereal mix. And they didn't find any difference in body weight or BMI or any of those things. But I don't remember off the top of my head if it was calorie matched or not. I know that they were getting about the same amount of calories from the meals, but I don't remember if that was forced upon the participants or if that was ad lib and they just ended up eating the same. So yeah, I think it's a valid question. And I think it might also vary from person to person. Someone might add a lot of oil and end up gaining some weight, and someone might, the opposite might also be true. Some people might find the oil not that appetizing, whereas the nuts might just disappear. I certainly get that people telling me that they have to really be careful with the nuts because they start eating and the bag disappears before you notice. So yeah, I think it's certainly possible.
Yeah, good tip. If that is you, someone who can sit down and demolish an entire bag of nuts, which certainly is the case for me, is to use the nuts as salad toppers or in smoothies, and that way you can kind of control how many or how much you're consuming in a serve. a little better. Another claim that's very common when it comes to seed oils is that they are inflammatory. I know you looked at inflammation. What did you find with regards to canola oil and whether this is pro-inflammatory or not?
Yeah, we found a number of trials as well, meta-analyses that go over a couple of inflammatory markers. And so, for example, the meta-analysis of 42 trials reports CRP, and there was no significant difference also between canola oil and the comparators. We found also some of the trials with refined canola oil also report inflammatory markers, and there also no significant increase. And then the other thing that's worth mentioning is this temporality aspect, because maybe eating it for a couple months doesn't raise inflammation, but eating it for years does. Certainly the linoleic acid, the main thing that people worry about in regards to inflammation, the main component of seed oils, there's long-term data on it. And if anything, people that eat more linoleic acid have lower inflammatory markers. So again, I think there's lots of things that could be done and lots of trials that could be tried and lots of things that I would love to see permutations, but I don't see the support for the idea that it's inflammatory. And we have a whole video from like a year ago going over inflammation and all of these seed oils systematically, from flax all the way to safflower, running the gamut of linoleic acid content. And there is just an overwhelming balance of evidence against the idea that they're pro-inflammatory. So that's the evidence that is out there that I've seen. If future evidence goes against that, very well. I'm glad to change my mind, but I don't see the support.
I had Philip Calder on my show a few weeks back, who has been researching omega-6 and omega-3 fats for 30 plus years at this point. And he made a point that many of the studies looking at linoleic acid are interventions that have added linoleic acid to a baseline diet that often contains an appreciable amount of linoleic acid to begin with. And he kind of made a caveat. He said he'd like to see some studies that do this in reverse and sort of lower linoleic acid in the diet rather than adding it, to see if inflammation may go down. And the idea being that perhaps people at baseline are already exceeding some type of important threshold, and already that inflammation is there. In your video, you mentioned an interesting trial. I think it was specific to canola oil that did a wash-in diet without any vegetable oils in a way to kind of reduce the likelihood that subjects already had elevated inflammatory markers from their baseline diet. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, it's a trial that was conducted in Germany. I think Mario Kratz is actually an author on that, interestingly. So we can ask him about the details. But yeah, the strong points of that trial are that it used a wash-in diet, and also it was a healthy young population. And European, if that means healthier, but they specify healthy students. I think they were college students, and it was German students. So it's not like it was middle-aged Americans that are obese or anything like that. Now, some caveats as well to that trial. It was kind of short. The wash-in diet, I think, was a couple weeks, and then the exposure to the oils was maybe a month. And another caveat is there was weight loss on all of the oils, which again argues against the fattening role of these oils, but makes it a little harder to interpret the inflammatory marker data, because weight loss is a powerful anti-inflammatory stimulus. But briefly, what they did is, for the wash-in, they put people on a high saturated fat diet. About 20% of the calories were coming from saturated fat. And then they split them into three groups. And the exposure oils were canola, olive oil, and sunflower seed oil. And then they let it go for another period of time. And the Yeah, the inflammatory markers, if anything, trended down during the exposure on all three groups. No statistical significance though. So essentially, no significant difference during the exposure. And again, that trend down is confounded by the weight loss. But yet again, I don't see evidence that these oils are inherently pro-inflammatory. If other trials in other contexts show that, great. So far, I haven't seen it.
What about lipid peroxidation? And what is this, and why does this come up, when people are talking about seed oils?
Yeah, it's a oxidative degradation of lipids in general. And I think the reason it comes up is because it is true that unsaturated fats are more prone to oxidation, at least when they're isolated in a test tube. I don't think that's controversial, and it has to be to do with the double bonds. Now, the question is, does that pan out in the context of the oil, where there are other components? And then the main question is, does that pan out in a living, breathing human consuming the oil? So I think those are all good questions. So we went through a couple of trials. There's a couple of trials in humans giving people canola oil, using, for example, saturated fat as a comparator, and then measuring oxidation products in bodily fluids. One of them is this category of chemicals called isoprostanes, which are oxidation byproducts. They measure them in urine, they measure them in plasma. They used a couple of different techniques to satisfy themselves, and no significant increase in these products with exposure to canola, even when it was used to cook. And then another product of lipid oxidation that people often ask about is 4-HNE. Pretty common to hear that. So we tried to look for that specifically, studies measuring that compound in canola oil, and it was undetectable with canola oil off the shelf, and very low production even after exposure to several hours of heat. It might have to do with vitamin E, which is an antioxidant that is pretty high in these seed oils, and so that might be the reason to explain why they are prone to oxidation by themselves, but they seem more resistant in the context of the oil. Another thing to mention, and this is getting a little bit more into the weeds, but there is an in vitro assay that in some trials indicates an increase in oxidation products with exposure to canola, and it's called T-bars, and it's a pretty common assay to find in papers, and it's basically a test tube or a kind of a lab plate assay where you run a reaction in the plate and then you measure colorimetrically. And so there seemed to be at first glance this discrepancy between that in vitro assay and the in vivo data. And we dug more to see if we could figure out why that was. And we found a fair amount of literature in that field, like this pretty specialized, nerdy literature going over the caveats of that assay. And it seems it's just very non-specific. So it's prone to artifacts. It reacts with many molecules that are not lipid oxidation products or even lipid related. It can react with carbohydrates, with amino acids, with even DNA. So it's good and it's sensitive for preparations that are purified lipids, for example. But once you have a more complex mixture, like in a bodily fluid, like in urine or blood, where you have protein, you have cells, you have carbohydrates in there, it just gives all kinds of signals. So it's been criticized in the literature. Now, happy to be contradicted by people who run these trials for a living, if that's wrong in any way. But this is pretty consistently what we found.
And with the relevant, I guess, human health outcomes here be cardiovascular disease, are we coming back to those meta-analyses of the long-term cohort studies that show a reduction in risk of cardiovascular disease?
Yeah, I think oxidation you could tie to almost any disease. You could certainly tie to cardiovascular. You could tie to diabetes. You could tie to cancer for sure. And we found we discussed in the video one. Actually, it's the same cohort study, the one with 500,000 people. People cooking with canola seem to have lower cancer mortality than people cooking with butter. So it doesn't seem to compute there either that it's just oxidating you to high heaven and turning you into a lump of coal. The other thing that's important to bear in mind in terms of big picture, which is what you're very astutely getting to, is that these inflammatory markers and oxidation markers, these things are relevant, but we shouldn't lose track of the big picture, because we know that, for example, with exercise, inflammatory markers go up acutely, and lipid peroxidation can be induced by exercise. So we just have to be careful with the logical leaps. This molecule went up, therefore the intervention is poison. Just a little bit of care, a little bit of caution, and look at the outcomes of people actually eating the food or performing the activity.
Right. And it comes back to logical consistency, I guess. Again, you made that point earlier. But if you're going to take the view that a mechanistic study that shows an increase in oxidation automatically means that this food is problematic and we should avoid exposure to it, then a similar logic is to look at exercise, as you just said, and acutely see an increase in oxidation and disregard all of the long-term data that shows exercise is associated with a reduction in risk of disease, and take the position that we should not exercise.
I think the key here is that we have to come up with a system that we are comfortable with, a heuristic system. So if your bar is that epidemiology doesn't count, as long as you're consistent with that across. If your bar is that you look at mechanisms and mechanisms trump outcomes, that's a strange bar, but if that's your bar, you have to be consistent with that across. The problem is doing this ad hoc and kind of gerrymandering data. I think a lot of times we see people working backwards. They decide first which foods they like or which foods they think are good and bad, and which activities are good and bad, and then they try to back rationalize the data. And that's where we see all this inconsistency.
Was there any data looking at liver fat or risk of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease?
Yeah, there was one trial that we included where everybody has had a fatty liver at baseline, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, so NAFLD. And then they were given olive oil or canola oil were the two exposures. And in both groups, there was an improvement in NAFLD metrics. Pretty impressive. 60-something to 70-something% of participants went into the normal range for the liver metrics. So again, doesn't seem to compute at all with these ideas that it's making you metabolically sick, it's making you fat, it's making you diabetic. Just trial after trial, outcome after outcome, if anything, pointing in the opposite direction. And this is what I was talking about when I said kind of my shock with where the evidence is and where the social media discourse is and what people are being exposed to consistently from the majority of influencers, and then what's been shown scientifically is almost night and day.
And what about just death from any cause, so total mortality? In those long-term cohort studies, particularly the ones that, and again, this is not specific to canola, but the ones that have the biomarker data and look at linoleic acid tissue levels, was there much signal there? Is there an effect on, I guess, firstly here, to separate these, is there an effect on linoleic acid consumption or tissue status and total mortality?
There is an association between linoleic acid tissue levels and both cardiovascular and all-cause mortality in meta-analyses of observational studies. And then, again, going back to that large cohort study with canola, where people were cooking with canola, they had lower all-cause mortality, again, associated with cooking with canola. So, again, caveats there. I wouldn't jump to cause and effect, but where's the evidence of toxicity?
So just to emphasize that first point you made there is that the higher the linoleic acid tissue levels, again, that's an omega-6 that is essential. So it has to have come into the body through diet. The higher those levels in tissue, in fat stores, the less risk someone had dying from all causes and from cardiovascular disease.
Yeah, and I've definitely seen a large meta-analyses showing the cardiovascular mortality. With the all-cause mortality, I forget if it's a cohort study or a meta-analysis of cohort studies. And another thing that I've had people ask me recently about the different tissues. Is it the plasma level or the level in the erythrocytes or the level in the adipose tissue? And they pretty much align. You might find, depending on the analysis, you might find that one trends and doesn't quite reach statistical significance, and the other one does. And then for the other outcome, it might be the other way around. But in general, they align pretty well. The direction of the effect is the same. You see statistically significant inverse correlations between levels in adipose tissue and cardiovascular mortality and all-cause mortality in different studies. So there doesn't seem to be, again, maybe the granularity, we can find some context dependence there, but there doesn't seem to be a clear difference where one is completely in the opposite direction.
Seed oils can always be a pretty emotionally charged topic. How has the canola oil video been received by your community?
It's all over the map, all the way from people celebrating it and going, finally, I'm tired of these influencers yelling that this is poison, all the way to, you're killing people. What are you doing? I mean, just all over the place. I think more polarizing than even some of the other topics that we thought were very polarizing. One thing that we've seen consistently that I thought was very interesting is people commenting that why even show these results? Why even go through the science when we already know these foods are poison? So it's kind of this logic. We've seen this over and over. That at first I thought, man, this is a complete inversion of logic. But then I thought this is actually very candid and very revealing what people are telling me. I had one comment that I even pulled up to tell you. I won't name names, but it says, you are probably the only YouTube channel that says seed oils are okay, compared to other 99 doctors that say to stay away from this inflammatory, highly processed fat. Bear in mind, this isn't being commented on a video where you go over the inflammatory data and it's not there. But these notions are so strong that people will still state the same thing, even though they've just watched the kind of the inverse. And then it says, this is the best part. The studies are there to support your claim, but I'll stay away from these oils for now. It's just like the aspartame studies. Many studies suggest it's okay and better than sugar, but I would still stay away from it. So I think it's a very honest insight into how people form their views, that the evidence is fine, but that alone doesn't tilt them. There is an emotional aspect. There is an aspect of this is an unhealthy or this is an unnatural food. So just showing me these data isn't quite convincing. And then the aspect of repetition. You are exposed to the same message over and over and over, mercilessly all day long on podcasts and social media by 99 doctors, as he said. And then here comes one rogue channel that says, actually, here's the evidence and it's the opposite. So we see a lot of this kind of borderline angry and frustrated people trying to make sense of these different messages and this cognitive dissonance. And that's where a lot of the times the funding comes in and, well, who's paying you? Why are you saying this? And these attempts to organize their thoughts, right? Then you can sense the kind of this anxiety to make sense of things. So yeah, I've come to be at peace with all of this because I understand people don't change their minds the first time they hear something, and that's actually good. If they did, it would just flip flop like crazy. They've heard the same thing over and over for months or years. Now they hear you one random guy say the opposite. They are skeptical, and rightly so. So I would hope they go through the evidence, or they question what they've heard before and question what I say as well, and then examine the facts.
Have you had many comments from people who have said, wow, you've changed my mind, you've changed my perspective. I can't believe I used to think that canola oil was toxic and that I must avoid it?
Yeah, several. All the way from some people just kind of surprised. Wow, I had never heard of all this, and I always heard that it's poison. Where was all this, or why? A lot of this also. Why aren't all these other people showing me this? And certainly some people saying, okay, this is compelling. My mind has changed. I would say everything across the spectrum, from go away to thanks to my mind has changed to now I know you're a crook to everything you can imagine. A lot of that too. Now you've lost all your credibility. And a lot of just why even tell people about this? You're going to confuse people and get them to eat these toxic foods. So why show this evidence of benefit? Which is a really interesting way to look at it.
It's also interesting to think about that idea that 99 doctors are saying it's toxic, and you're the one doctor saying that it's not. That might be representative of a kind of echo chamber that someone's found themselves in, but it wouldn't be representative of academics and scientists, for example, who are working on writing guidelines.
Yeah. And when people say this, you're the first channel or you're the only channel saying these things, it surprises them, but it's by design. That's by design that they're encountering this content coming from us, because I don't make content on things that people are already getting messages that align with the evidence, because it offers no value. But it's these things that I see people coming with a question that doesn't reflect the science at all. This is where we try to focus. All these confusion, these different misconceptions with cholesterol and all the stuff with saturated fat that doesn't reflect the scientific evidence. That's what our content focuses on. So, yeah, I think it's exactly the clash between what most scientists in this field would say and what they hear on social media. That's the clash that I'm seeing, but that's exactly what we're trying to deliver. And at the end of the day, my goal is not to convince them that all canola oil is good. I really don't care if people consume canola oil or not. If nobody eats it, fine with me. My goal is that people have access to this information and that they know that this is out there and that they know that these results have been obtained. Once they have this information in front of them, then they can make their informed decision. But if they don't know that this exists, it's not an educated choice by design. So that's the only thing that I worry about.
Hey friends, if you'd like to stay connected and reinforce the valuable insights from this show, let's connect on Instagram. You can find me at Simon Hill. That's at Simon Hill. I look forward to seeing you there. All right, let's dive back into the episode. Let's finish with some rapid fire questions. And I appreciate these might be a little difficult for you given how nuanced you are with your research and your approach here. First one, is canola oil a better option than olive oil?
Unclear. If I'm allowed to elaborate a little bit more, no clear evidence of superiority. I think one argument that I've heard is that there's more evidence behind olive oil. There's just been more research done. I think that's fine. So maybe our level of confidence is a little higher, but no clear evidence of one being better than the other. So I think it's, unclear. I've had viewers say, this is all fine, but I'd rather eat olive oil. I don't see a problem. I've had other viewers say, thanks for all this. I eat canola oil and I like it. Fine too. Yeah.
What about canola oil versus coconut oil?
Haven't seen outcome data of a comparison. What I have seen is randomized trials comparing them for lipids. And it's what you would expect. There is a trend towards higher LDL cholesterol on coconut oil. Not every trial reaches statistical significance. Some do, some don't, but that's the direction of effect. And that's what you would expect based on the composition of saturated fat in coconut oil. So I would say it depends on the amount you eat and depends on you, right? Your lipids and all that. If your lipids are great and you eat a little bit of coconut oil and you like it, I don't see a problem. But if you're loading up and your lipids are a mess, that is something where you could try to tweak. There may be room for improvement.
Right. This is where understanding your own levels and your own individual risk of cardiovascular disease, for example, is important in kind of making that decision. Is canola oil a better option than soybean, corn, sunflower, cottonseed oils, these other seed oils that are richer in linoleic acid and less rich in monounsaturated fats?
I also have not seen clear evidence of superiority either way. People seem to be more worried about these other seed oils, maybe because of the linoleic acid content. And I haven't done this type of systematic, more or less exhaustive search for every one of those oils. So I would say my level of confidence is lower for those just because I haven't looked as much. So for me right now, unclear. I don't have a strong position on it. Open to either direction or to a tie.
Is it safe to pan fry, saute, and bake with canola oil?
I think a good rule of thumb is to respect the smoke point. And that's, for people who haven't heard of it, it's the temperature at which the oil starts to emit smoke, and it's an indicator of stability to temperature exposure. And the smoke point for canola is around 200 Celsius centigrade. So give or take, actually for the cold press, it's a little lower, and for the refined, it's higher. But somewhere in that range, 180 to 240. I think sauteing is a good choice. I would avoid extreme temperatures, and I would definitely avoid long exposures, like hours of deep frying or hours and hours and hours in the oven at very high temperature. There's more uncertainty there. But sauteing with it, I really haven't seen evidence of concern.
Is cold pressed canola superior to regular refined heated canola?
I feel like my answer to all the rapid fire questions is the same, unclear. Have not seen evidence of superiority. The trials looking at refined canola seem to show the same direction of effect. If there's a difference, it doesn't seem to be enormous, but I would not rule out that there is one. Like I said a while back, I have not seen a trial comparing them both in the same trial head to head. So I'm completely open to the possibility that one is better, but I have not seen evidence of that.
How much of the research that you came across would you say is funded by the canola industry?
A small part. So we actually went through, because we knew people were going to ask, so we went through the trials and cohort studies. Every study that was cited, we went through and checked. And I think it was out of, I think we covered 30 or so trial studies in general on the video. And I think 3 had funding from anything related. So not necessarily canola, but any seed oil or any vegetable oil related industry. And then I think 2 others had not funding, but the oil they used was donated by the manufacturer. So if we want to consider that a tie to industry, I think it was 5 out of 30. So a minority. In general, with this concern with funding, I think it's fine to worry about funding, to ask about funding, to note the funding source. What I would alert people to is someone replacing appeal to funding instead of scientific appraisal. that's a massive red flag. So if people are not showing you the evidence or dismissing entire bodies of evidence just because of funding, and sometimes I'm starting to see it's not even that they're saying it's funded by, it's a supposition of funding. It's my idea is this, all the evidence is against it, but big food, big pharma. It's not even saying that this study is funded by, it's just financial interests. I don't trust anything. I would be very wary of that. And then the last thing about funding is, just like we said for a number of the other concerns, the reproducibility, which is really the real currency of science. If you're looking at an individual trial, you're always going to be wary, regardless of who funded it. By the time you're looking at an entire field, dozens of studies done by different researchers over 30 years in different institutions, some funded, some not, some are funded by industry, some funded by government, some funded by private, whatever, different sources, right? Different experimental approaches, and you see a concordance of evidence. That's where the confidence comes from. And when you have that map, the funding in 5 trials out of 30, it's easy to see that that's not going to change the landscape fundamentally.
Hypothetical here. You've reviewed all of the evidence on this topic, or most of the kind of important
I tried.
I'd say.
Yeah.
Maybe all is not the right word, but you've spent more time than most people I know reading the evidence on canola. Let's just say that. If you were forced to try and argue the position that canola oil is toxic, with your understanding of the evidence, how would you have to look at the available evidence in order to do that, and how would you argue that position?
To a group of scientists or to a group of lay people in the public?
Convince me that canola oil is toxic.
After what you've heard, I don't think I can. Basically, the argument would have to be not mentioning all the human health data, not mentioning any of that, and then basically pointing to chemical structures and quantifications of compounds and oil, and then hypothesizing that causes problems, but never checking the actual health effect in human beings consuming it. Because the balance of evidence of the human health data is pretty overwhelming. The other way that you could do it is by hypothesizing a very convoluted hypothesis that all of these trials and all of these cohort studies have to be wrong. So all of the markers, for some reason, it lowers lipids, it improves or leaves glucose metabolism where it was, it doesn't affect inflammation, but it still does something else, and all the cohort studies fail to pick it up. Something convoluted like that kind of skirts all of the evidence. I wouldn't say that that's formally impossible. I would say that the likelihood is low, and it's good to keep all possibilities in mind. But yeah, when the evidence for that comes, great. Until then, this is what we got.
Do you think the fact that canola oil is often in the ingredient list of ultra-processed foods hurts it? People see that and automatically throw it into the same bucket as refined sugars, other additives, and sort of assume that it's playing a role in the negative effects of that food and consuming a lot of ultra-processed foods, and the assumption there being that it is inherently problematic. It's not the kind of overall ultra-processed food matrix.
Yeah, I think it's definitely part of the argument that people hear, and then part of the argument that they integrate. And it goes hand in hand with this idea that it's an unnatural food. And then I think what clinches it for a lot of people is the personal experience, because they're told these foods are unnatural and poisonous. And look, don't trust me, just try it. Remove seed oils from your diet and see how you feel. And I have countless people saying this in the comments. All these trials are fine, but I cut out the seed oils and I got healthier and I feel better. And every time I've asked follow-up questions, what they actually did was they stopped eating potato chips and Pop-Tarts, and they stopped eating to Burger King, and they started cooking more at home. So that's not surprising that they got great health results. But this jump between, because they're told this is what cutting out seed oils means, is stop eating junk food. So I think they've become synonymous in people's minds, and that's why it's difficult to separate. Now, in practical terms, to the extent that people are removing junk food from their diet and feeling better, I think that's all good, whatever they call it. But like I said before, my problem is the clunky decision making and the clunky thought process that's going to raise the risk that they make other bad decisions in other areas. That one I don't mind. Cutting out the seed oils, I don't see a problem. Cutting out the junk food, phenomenal. But then this sort of kind of dirty reasoning is going to permeate other decisions and is going to potentially cause other problems. So that's my only concern.
Right. The problem there being that when you're removing those foods, you're removing many elements from your diet, not just that seed oil. And the benefit of these studies that you're going through, at least the clinical trials and the cohort studies to an extent, are more interested at trying to isolate the effects of canola oil itself as opposed to the consumption of canola oil in ultra-processed foods or the effect of ultra-processed foods.
Yeah, it's the fact that there's another 1,000 ingredients. It's the fact that they're probably reducing their overall caloric intake, because that's reproducible. When you reduce ultra-processed foods, you cut down on calories. That's very consistent. Yeah, I think those are the main confounders there. Oh, and also the fact that if this component of eating out, it's possible that the preparation, if what they're doing at Burger King is frying the oil for 6 days without replacing it, it's entirely possible that it's creating other problems there in terms of oxidation or degradation of the oil by the time you're eating it. That doesn't reflect buying canola oil and using it at home.
Or the production of trans fats. What are the major gaps in the research looking at canola oil and human health? What studies would you like to see?
More detail in terms of types of canola oil. So this question that we've touched on a couple of times of the cold pressed versus refined. I'd love to see trials comparing those. I'd love to see longer trials. Most of the trials are short duration. I'd love to see 1 year or a couple of years long trials giving people canola compared to other fats. The duration, I would say, is the main caveat. The washout factor is interesting as well. The wash-in diet element is very interesting as well. So if a trial like that had a several month wash-in and then a year or something like that of follow-up, or several years if we're going for broke, that would be great. Love to see it. Yeah, those would be great. Those would really elevate the confidence or contradict the evidence we have right now.
Gil, this has been great. I think you will have changed the perspective of many of the listeners next time they're walking down the cooking oil aisle in the grocery store, that's for sure. Remind folks how they can connect with you online. You mentioned a few of the other videos that you've done along with this canola oil video, of course. If people want to check those out and see those in full, where can we send them?
So the YouTube channel is NutritionMadeSimple. You can find that on YouTube. And then if people want to connect on Twitter, my handle is @NutritionMadeS3.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for coming back to join us. We really appreciate all your work. There you have it, friends. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did and want to stay up to date with future episodes, be sure to hit that subscribe button on YouTube and follow on Apple or Spotify. Finally, thank you for showing up and the effort that you're making to take control of your health. I look forward to hanging out with you again in the next episode.